There's a pattern in financial history that has repeated 4 times in the last 117 years. And it's not complicated. It's not hidden. It's brazenly obvious once you see it. Banks take excessive risks to maximize profits. The risks blow up and create a financial crisis. The government steps in with taxpayer money to bail out the banks. And the same banks that caused the crisis, the same executives who made the disastrous decisions, profit from the bailout while facing zero consequences. In 1907, J.P. Morgan orchestrated a bailout that saved failing banks while massively enriching himself and eliminating competitors. In 1929, the banks that caused the crash through speculation and fraud got government support while millions of Americans lost everything. In 2008, the banks that created toxic mortgage securities and nearly destroyed the global economy got $700 billion in taxpayer bailouts, and their executives received bonuses. And in 2023, when regional banks collapsed from their own mismanagement, the big banks bought them at fire sale prices with government assistance. 4 financial crises, 4 government bailouts, and every single time the pattern is identical. Banks privatize profits during the boom, socialize losses during the bust, and the people responsible face no consequences. In fact, they get richer. This isn't capitalism. This isn't free markets. This is a rigged system where a handful of financial institutions have captured the government and turned taxpayers into their personal insurance policy. And the pattern says it's going to happen again because moral hazard, the economic term for getting rewarded for bad behavior, guarantees that if banks know they'll be bailed out, they'll take even bigger risks next time. This is the story of how the bank bailout pattern actually works, who profits when banks fail, and why the system is designed to protect bankers at the expense of everyone else. Before we trace the pattern through 4 financial crises, you need to understand what a bank bailout actually is and why it's different from normal business failure. In a free market, when a company makes bad decisions, it fails. The shareholders lose their investment, the executives lose their jobs, and the assets are sold off. That's capitalism, creative destruction. Bad businesses die, and their resources go to better managed companies. But banks are different, or at least that's what we're told. Banks are systemically important. They're too big to fail. If one major bank collapses, it could trigger a cascade of failures because banks lend to each other, hold each other's assets, and are so interconnected that one failure could bring down the entire financial system. This is the justification for bailouts. The government steps in with taxpayer money to prevent systemic collapse. They inject capital into failing banks, guarantee deposits, buy toxic assets, and provide emergency loans, all to prevent the dominoes from falling. And in theory, once the crisis passes, the banks repay the money and the taxpayer is made whole. That's the theory. The reality is very different. The reality is that bailouts protect the banks, the shareholders, and especially the executives who caused the crisis. They face no consequences. They keep their jobs, their bonuses, and their wealth. Meanwhile, taxpayers bear the cost. Ordinary people lose their jobs in the recession that follows. They lose their homes, their retirement savings decline, and they pay for the bailout through taxes, inflation, and reduced government services. But here's what makes this truly corrupt. The banks know they'll be bailed out. That's called moral hazard. If you know you'll be rescued from bad decisions, you have every incentive to take bigger risks, because if the risks pay off, you keep the profits. If the risks blow up, the taxpayer covers your losses. It's heads I win, tails you lose. And this moral hazard means banks take risks they would never take in a real free market where failure meant actual failure. They leverage up, chase yield, and create complex financial products they don't understand because, why not? If it works, they get rich. If it fails, they get bailed out. This is the system, and it's been the system for over a century. Let's look at how it started. The first modern bank bailout happened in 1907. And it established the pattern that every bailout since has followed. In the early 1900s, America didn't have a central bank. There was no Federal Reserve. Banking was less regulated, and that meant banks could take enormous risks. In 1907, several banks and trust companies had speculated heavily in copper stocks and other risky investments. When those investments failed, the banks faced runs. Depositors panicked and demanded their money back. Banks didn't have enough reserves because they'd lent it all out. And without a central bank to provide emergency liquidity, the banks were on the verge of collapse. Enter J.P. Morgan. Jean-Pierre Morgan was the most powerful banker in America. He controlled enormous wealth and had connections to every major financial institution. In October 1907, as banks began failing, Morgan organized a private bailout. He gathered the heads of New York's major banks in his library, literally locked them in a room until they agreed to pool resources to save failing institutions. Morgan himself put up millions. Other banks contributed, and together they injected enough capital to stop the panic. The system was saved. JP Morgan was hailed as a hero, the man who saved American finance. But let's look at who actually benefited. JP Morgan profited massively from the panic. During the crisis, he bought assets at fire sale prices. Companies that were distressed sold themselves to Morgan at huge discounts. The Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, a major competitor to Morgan's U.S. Steel, was acquired during the panic for a fraction of its value. Morgan's already dominant position in American finance became even stronger. His competitors, the smaller banks and trust companies that failed, were eliminated. And Morgan emerged from the crisis with more power, more wealth, and more control over American banking than before. Who paid for this? The depositors who lost their savings and the failed banks. The workers who lost their jobs in the recession that followed. The small businesses that couldn't get credit. While JP Morgan and the big banks that survived consolidated power, ordinary Americans suffered. And here's the key lesson from 1907. The bailout wasn't about saving the system, it was about saving the powerful institutions and eliminating competitors. Morgan chose which banks to save and which to let fail. The ones he saved were his allies, the ones that failed were his competitors. This is the pattern. The crisis is used to consolidate power. And the people in charge of the bailout are the same people who benefit from it. The Panic of 1907 also led directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. The official story is that America needed a central bank to prevent future panics. The real story is that the big banks wanted a lender of last resort that they controlled. And that's what the Federal Reserve became. A private institution owned by banks with the power to create money and bail out banks in crisis. JP Morgan and his allies got exactly what they wanted, a permanent bailout mechanism. The pattern was established. The next iteration of the bank bailout pattern came with the 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression that followed. In the 1920s, banks fueled a massive speculative bubble. They made loans for stock speculation. They created investment trusts that were leveraged 10 to 1, using borrowed money to buy stocks. They engaged in insider trading, market manipulation, and fraud. Bank executives used depositor money to speculate in the stock market. It was a casino, and everyone was getting rich as long as stock prices kept rising. But in October 1929, the bubble burst. Stock prices collapsed. Companies that were overleveraged failed. And banks that had lent money for speculation faced massive losses. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks failed. 9,000. Bank runs swept the country. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. Banks didn't have the cash because they'd lent it out for speculation. The banking system imploded, and the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history, devastated the country. Unemployment hit 25%, GDP collapsed by 30%, millions lost their homes, red lines stretched for blocks. It was an economic catastrophe. Now you'd think the banks that caused this through reckless speculation and fraud would face consequences. You'd think executives would go to jail. You'd think shareholders would be wiped out. You'd think that in a free market, these institutions would fail and be replaced by better managed banks. But that's not what happened. President Herbert Hoover established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932 to provide loans to failing banks. This was the first large-scale government bank bailout. Taxpayer money flowed to banks that had gambled and lost. Franklin Roosevelt, who became president in 1933, continued the bailout programs. The RFC lent billions to banks and businesses. But here's what's crucial to understand. The banks that survived the Depression and received government support were the big banks. JP Morgan, Chase National Bank, National City Bank, which would become Citibank. The small community banks that served working people, they failed. 9,000 of them. But the Wall Street giants that had caused the crisis through speculation got bailouts. They got government support. They survived. And they emerged from the Depression even more dominant than before because their competitors had been eliminated. The executives who ran these banks during the 1920s speculation faced almost no consequences. Some retired, some moved to other banks, but almost none went to jail. Almost none lost their personal fortunes. Ferdinand Pecora, the prosecutor who investigated Wall Street's role in the crash, found massive fraud, insider trading, and market manipulation. His hearings exposed the criminal behavior of bank executives, but the prosecutions were minimal. The powerful bankers who destroyed millions of lives walked away. In fact, many of them profited from the Depression. They bought assets at Depression-era prices, real estate, businesses, and stocks. The wealthy accumulated more wealth during the Depression while everyone else suffered. This is the second iteration of the pattern. Banks create a bubble through reckless behavior. The bubble bursts, the economy collapses. Small banks fail while big banks get government support. Executives face no consequences. The powerful consolidate more power. And taxpayers foot the bill for the cleanup. The pattern was repeating, and it would repeat again. The third iteration of the bank bailout pattern is the 2008 financial crisis. This is the clearest, most documented example of how the pattern works. Because unlike 1907 and 1929, we have detailed records of exactly what the banks did, exactly how they caused the crisis, and exactly how they profited from the bailout. In the early 2000s, banks created a housing bubble through predatory lending and financial fraud on a scale never before seen. They issued mortgages to people who couldn't afford them, subprime loans with adjustable rates that would reset to unaffordable levels. No documentation loans where borrowers didn't have to prove income were called ninja loans. No income, no job, or assets. The banks didn't care if borrowers could repay because they weren't holding the loans. The banks packaged these toxic mortgages into securities called mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs. They sold these securities to investors around the world, claiming they were safe, AAA-rated investments. The rating agencies, paid by the banks, gave these toxic assets top ratings. And investors, including pension funds, insurance companies, and foreign banks, bought trillions of dollars worth of these securities. Meanwhile, some banks were betting against the very securities they were selling. Goldman Sachs created CDOs, sold them to clients, and simultaneously shorted them, betting they would fail. That's fraud, but it was legal. By 2006, the housing market peaked. By 2007, subprime mortgages were defaulting in massive numbers. By 2008, the securities built on these mortgages were collapsing in value. Lehman Brothers, one of the largest investment banks, filed for bankruptcy in September 2008. Bear Stearns had collapsed earlier. Merrill Lynch was sold to Bank of America to avoid failure. AIG, the insurance giant that had insured these mortgage securities, was on the verge of collapse, and the entire global financial system was freezing. Banks stopped lending to each other. The credit market seized up. The economy was going off a cliff. The government's response was the largest bailout in history. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, authorized $700 billion in taxpayer money to bail out banks. The Federal Reserve created trillions more in emergency lending programs. Altogether, when you count all the lending facilities, guarantees, and asset purchases, the bailout was in the tens of trillions. The banks that had caused the crisis through fraud and reckless lending were saved. Citigroup, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all of them received billions in TARP funds and access to trillions in Fed programs. And here's where the pattern becomes most obvious. The executives who ran these banks during the bubble, who personally profited from the fraud, faced no consequences. Not one major Wall Street executive went to jail. Not one. Compare that to the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s, where over 1,000 bankers were prosecuted and many went to prison. In 2008, despite fraud on a far larger scale, there were 0 prosecutions of major bank executives. Why? Because these executives had connections to government. Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary who designed the bailout, was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Tim Geithner, who became Treasury Secretary in 2009, had close ties to Wall Street. The people in charge of the bailout were the same people who had worked for and with the banks being bailed out. Not only did executives avoid jail, they received bonuses. In 2008, as banks were failing and receiving taxpayer bailouts, Wall Street paid out $18 billion in bonuses. $18 billion in bonuses for destroying the economy. The American people were furious, but nothing changed. The banks argued that they needed to pay bonuses to retain talent, the same talent that had just destroyed the global economy, and the government let them do it. AIG, which received $182 billion in bailouts, paid out hundreds of millions in executive bonuses. When this became public, there was outrage, but the bonuses were paid anyway. Meanwhile, 9 million Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. Unemployment hit 10%. Millions lost their jobs. Retirement accounts lost trillions in value. And the banks that caused it, they were not only saved, they became bigger. The crisis led to consolidation. JP Morgan bought Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual. Bank of America bought Merrill Lynch and Countrywide. Wells Fargo bought Wachovia. The big banks that survived became even bigger. They were now officially too big to fail. The government had proven it would bail them out no matter what. And the final insult, the banks that received bailouts profited from the bailout. They borrowed money from the Fed at near 0 interest rates and used it to buy treasury bonds, paying higher rates, free money. They used bailout funds to buy distressed assets at depression prices, real estate, businesses, competitors. By 2010, most of the big banks were back to record profits. Goldman Sachs had its most profitable year ever in 2009, the year after the bailout. The pattern had repeated perfectly. Banks cause crisis, government bails them out, banks profit, executives face 0 consequences, taxpayers pay the bill, and the banks become even more powerful. You'd think after 2008 things would change. You'd think there would be regulations to prevent another crisis. You'd think banks would be more careful knowing that moral hazard and excessive risk-taking had nearly destroyed the economy. But moral hazard works in reverse. When you bail out bad behavior, you get more bad behavior. And that brings us to 2023. In March 2023, Silicon Valley Bank, the 16th largest bank in America, collapsed. It was the second largest bank failure in U.S. history. A week later, Signature Bank failed. A week after that, First Republic Bank was on the verge of collapse. 3 major regional banks failing in weeks. What happened? Silicon Valley Bank made catastrophically stupid investment decisions. They took depositor money and invested heavily in long-term treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. When interest rates were near zero, these seemed safe. But when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates rapidly in 2022 and 2023 to fight inflation, the value of those bonds collapsed. SVB was sitting on massive unrealized losses. They were technically insolvent. When depositors realized this and started withdrawing money, SVB couldn't meet the withdrawals because their assets were worth far less than their liabilities. The bank failed in 48 hours. Signature Bank and First Republic had similar problems: mismanagement, poor risk management, and when depositors lost confidence, the banks collapsed. Now in a free market, these banks would fail. Depositors would lose uninsured deposits above the $250,000 FDIC limit, and the assets would be sold off. That's how capitalism is supposed to work, but that's not what happened. The federal government, the FDIC, and the Federal Reserve stepped in immediately. They guaranteed all deposits at these banks, not just the insured amounts, all of them. This was a bailout of depositors, including corporations and wealthy individuals who had millions or tens of millions in these banks. Why? Because many of those depositors were tech companies, venture capital firms, and wealthy Silicon Valley executives, the people with political connections. The government also arranged for larger banks to buy the failed banks. JP Morgan bought most of First Republic's assets at a massive discount. The FDIC agreed to share losses with JP Morgan, meaning taxpayers would cover part of any losses JP Morgan incurred. JP Morgan got First Republic's customer base, assets, and branches at a fire sale price with the government covering the downside risk. It was a sweetheart deal, and it made JP Morgan even bigger, even more too big to fail. The same pattern played out with the other failed banks. The big banks, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, used the crisis to acquire competitors at bargain prices with government assistance. They eliminated mid-sized regional competitors, and they emerged from the crisis larger and more dominant. The 2023 crisis might have been smaller than 2008, but the pattern was identical. Banks mismanage risk, crisis hits, government steps in, big banks profit, executives face no consequences, and taxpayers backstop the losses. Now, let's break down the pattern explicitly, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Step 1. Banks take excessive risks to maximize short-term profits. They lend recklessly. They speculate, they create complex financial products, and they leverage up far beyond safe levels. Why? Because if the risks pay off, they make enormous profits. Executives get bonuses. Shareholders get returns. Everyone gets rich during the boom. Step 2, the risks blow up. The investments fail. The speculation loses. The complex financial products turn toxic. The leverage becomes unsustainable, and suddenly the bank is insolvent or illiquid, can't meet its obligations, faces bankruptcy. Step 3, the government steps in. Because the bank is systemically important, or because powerful depositors and creditors would lose money, the government declares the bank too important to fail. Taxpayer money is deployed, bailouts, guarantees, emergency loans, whatever it takes to keep the bank alive. Step 4, the bank is saved, but faces minimal consequences. Maybe some executives are replaced. Maybe shareholders lose some value, but the institution survives. And more importantly, the executives who made the disastrous decisions keep most of their wealth. They keep their bonuses from the boom years, don't go to jail, don't face fraud charges, and don't lose their personal fortunes. Step 5, the bank often profits from the crisis. They buy competitors at distressed prices. They borrow from the government at low rates and invest in higher-yielding assets. They consolidate market share, and within a few years, they're back to record profits. Step 6, taxpayers bear the cost. Through direct bailouts, through the recession that follows, through inflation caused by money printing, and through reduced government services because funds went to banks, the public pays always. In Step 7, the pattern repeats because moral hazard guarantees it. If banks know they'll be bailed out, they have every incentive to take even bigger risks next time. Why be conservative? Why maintain proper reserves? Why avoid speculation? The government has proven they'll rescue you, so take bigger bets. If you win, you keep the profits. If you lose, taxpayers cover it. It's a ratchet that only goes one direction. More risk, bigger bailouts, greater concentration of power. Who profits from this pattern? The big banks, the executives, the shareholders of the banks that survive, and the government officials who get jobs at these banks after leaving office. Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary during the 2008 bailout, made hundreds of millions at Goldman Sachs before joining the government. Tim Geithner, who implemented the bailout programs, went to work at a Wall Street private equity firm after leaving Treasury. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington is real, and it ensures the people regulating banks are the same people who profit from banks. Who pays? Taxpayers, small businesses that can't get credit during crises, workers who lose jobs in recessions, homeowners who lose their houses, retirees whose savings decline, everyone except the banks. The system is designed to protect banks at all costs, and it's been designed that way since 1907. 4 financial crises, 4 bailouts, same pattern every time. 4 times in 117 years, the bank bailout pattern has played out identically. In 1907, J.P. Morgan orchestrated a bailout that enriched himself and consolidated his power while eliminating competitors. In 1929, the banks that caused the crash through speculation got government support, while 9,000 small banks failed and executives faced almost no consequences. In 2008, the largest bailout in history saved the banks that had committed fraud. Executives received bonuses and taxpayers paid trillions. And in 2023, regional banks failed due to mismanagement. Big banks bought them at fire sale prices with government help, and the cycle continued. The pattern is simple. Banks privatize profits during booms. They socialize losses during busts. They take risks knowing they'll be bailed out. And when the inevitable crisis comes, they get rescued while ordinary people suffer. Moral hazard guarantees this will happen again. As long as banks know they're too big to fail, they'll take risks that are too big to succeed. The next crisis is already being built. Banks are taking risks right now that will blow up eventually. Commercial real estate is a disaster waiting to happen. Corporate debt is at record highs. Bank leverage ratios are back to pre-2008 levels. The ingredients for the next crisis are all there. And when it comes, the same pattern will repeat. Banks will fail, the government will step in, taxpayers will pay. Executives will face no consequences. And the big banks will use the crisis to become even bigger, because that's what always happens 4 times in a row. Perfect consistency. The pattern never breaks because the system is designed this way. The banks have captured the government. The regulators are run by former bank executives. The politicians are funded by bank donations. The revolving door ensures that the people in charge of oversight are the same people who profit from the industry. This isn't capitalism, it's crony capitalism, it's socialism for the rich and capitalism for everyone else. If you're a small business and you fail, you're done. But if you're a bank and you fail after gambling with depositors' money, you get bailed out with taxpayer funds. The game is rigged and everyone knows it. That's why trust in institutions has collapsed. That's why people are angry, because they see the pattern, they see who profits, and they see who pays. The next financial crisis is coming, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, but it's coming. And when it arrives, the banks will line up for another bailout. They'll say they're too important to fail. They'll say the economy will collapse without them. They'll say taxpayers must rescue them, and the government will comply because the government works for the banks. The pattern has repeated 4 times. It will repeat a 5th time and a 6th until either the system collapses completely or people demand actual accountability. But accountability would require prosecuting bank executives, breaking up too big to fail banks, and ending the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington. And that would require the people in power to act against their own interests. So don't hold your breath. The pattern will continue. The banks will profit and you'll pay for it. 4 times proves it's not an accident. It's the design. If this opened your eyes to how the bank bailout pattern actually works and who profits from financial crises, subscribe. Because when the next crisis comes, and it will come, you'll want to understand exactly what's happening and why the same banks that caused it will emerge richer and more powerful while everyone else suffers. The pattern never lies, and the pattern says we're paying for the next bailout right now. We just don't know it yet.